Hello class, it's Mr. Mormon. Welcome to the second half of our cell membrane video. We're going to finish talking about how things are transported across the cell membrane and then move on to talk about cell-to-cell communication and how the cell membrane is involved in that. When we left off on the last video, we were talking about active transport. Active transport is moving materials against the concentration gradient from low to high concentration. Now, there's a special type of active transport called phagocytosis. In phagocytosis, um, the cell membrane actually, part of the cell membrane engulfs something that needs to be brought into the cell and pinches off to become a food vacuole inside the cell. When you're moving things into the cell, that's called endocytosis. Moving things out of the cell is exocytosis. Here we see some amoeba, which are microscopic single-celled organisms that live in pond water. They are protists. The interesting thing about amoeba is they can be any shape they want to be. They can change their cell membrane and allow the cytoplasm to flow out into these things called pseudopods. Each one of these amoeba are eating. This one's about to eat this is another microorganism here called a paramecium. And what's going to happen is the cell is going to totally engulf and surround the food that's being eaten. And it's going to end up being a food vacuole inside. Okay, after it goes completely around, it breaks off and becomes a food vacuole inside the cell. That's endocytosis. After everything is digested, the wastes are then moved to the edge of the cell, the food vacuole opens up, and the waste is removed from the cell. I think this diagram and these questions will help us understand this a little better. So here we see a cell. It's bringing in some food. This microbe here is being brought in as food, and it forms into this structure, what would that be? What cell structure would A represent? Again, this is storing some food. A would be a food vacuole. Now, cell structure B here is coming and attaching to the food vacuole. This structure, I will tell you, is going to be releasing enzymes for digestion into the food vacuole. What part do you think that would be? Right, that's a lysosome. Now, the life functions that are going on at D and E would be digestion, and then absorption of nutrients. All the good stuff that the cell needs would be absorbed into the cytoplasm. The food vacuole then moves to the edge of the cell, and the waste is moved out of the cell, and that would be exocytosis. Okay, let's do a quick overview of the things we learned about the cell membrane's role in transport. We learned about passive transport and active transport. Passive transport is molecules moving from high to low concentration down the concentration gradient. Active transport is moving from low to high against the concentration gradient. Passive transport requires no energy. Active transport is going to need energy in the form of ATP. Examples for passive transport would be diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. Active transport is carried out by transport proteins, or when the cell membrane pinches in, we call that phagocytosis. Endocytosis is moving in, exocytosis is moving out. Okay, so let's move on to talk about how the cell membrane helps the cells communicate, cell-to-cell communication. In this diagram, we see two cells right next to each other, and they are communicating chemically. Okay, there's chemical signals going from the surface of this cell, which are represented by these green molecules, and the key to receiving the message is having these receptor molecules. That's what these purple things are. These are proteins on the surface of this second cell which are receiving the chemical message. In order to get the message, a cell has to have the proper receptor molecules on its surface. Here's another artist drawing that shows the same idea. This cell has receptor molecules for this particular chemical message. Notice the shape and the fit. These would not fit. Therefore, this cell is a target cell for this message, but will not be able to receive these chemical messages. Again, the key here is shape. The receptor molecules have to have the right shape for the signal that's being sent. In multicellular organisms like you and I, a lot of the communication that's done to maintain homeostasis is performed by the nervous system. Your central nervous system includes your brain and spinal cord, and then you have all these peripheral nerves that go to all parts of your body. Now, the nervous system is composed of nerve cells, also known as neurons. The job of a neuron is to send messages. Now, traveling through the neuron, the message is electrical. But the message needs to be passed from one neuron to the next for it to keep going. But the neurons don't touch. There's a little gap in between, which is shown here in this magnification. Called this. That gap is called the synapse. Because these two neurons are not actually touching, the message, the electrical message, cannot continue across the synapse. So this is where we need a chemical message to jump across. So let's say the message is moving from left to right. The electrical message reaches the end of this neuron, and then it has to jump across the synapse. That's where these little chemicals come into play. These little boxes represent small chemical messages that are going to jump across. They're called neurotransmitters. Now, the key here is that there has to be a receptor molecule on cell B to receive that chemical message. Once that chemical message is received, the electrical message can continue down that neuron. This all happens very, very quickly, sending messages to and from your brain through your nerves. Here's another artist drawing showing the same idea. Again, our message is moving from left to right. It needs to jump across the synapse, which is magnified down here. This little space here, the synapse, is being magnified. And we can see the neurotransmitters, the little chemical messages that are jumping across. Now, cell B, the cell on the right, has the proper receptor molecules to receive both this chemical message, and it has different receptor molecules to receive this chemical message. It's interesting to note that drugs that affect your brain and nervous system very often are working on this part of the message. A pain-killing drug, for example, might gobble up these neurotransmitters so the chemical message does not get across. That would stop the pain message. Some pain medicines might be blocking up the receptor molecules so they cannot receive the message. That would also stop the pain signal. Okay, so far we've seen how cells can communicate to other cells right in their vicinity or locally or right next door. That's called paracrine signaling. Here we see a cell. It's communicating chemically with the cells next to it. These are nerve cells doing the same thing. The neurotransmitter is going right across the space to the next nerve cell, keeping the message going. Remember that this all depends on having the right receptor molecules. Now, these are cells right next to each other. Next, we're going to talk about the endocrine system and endocrine signaling. The endocrine system is made of many glands. These glands produce chemical messages called hormones that are released into the blood, travel all throughout the body, and then are received or picked up by the receptor molecules on the target cells. So here we see the endocrine cell. This would be a cell in a gland releasing these little blue chemical messages. Those would be the hormones. They travel all throughout the body in the blood, and this is a target cell that has the right receptor molecules to receive that chemical message. All of these signaling systems require the cells to have the receptor molecules to receive the message. Receptor molecules attached to the cell membrane. And this diagram is showing the same idea. A would be a cell in the gland producing the hormones. Hormones travel all throughout the body in the blood, and they're received by cells with the right receptor molecules. Now, B is a target cell. This cell does have the right receptor. C has the wrong receptor and is not a target cell. Therefore, it will not receive the chemical message. Here we can see how the cell gets affected by the hormone. The hormone attaches to the receptor molecule. This causes other chemical reactions to happen through the cytoplasm, and a change is made in the nucleus, in the DNA, and it changes the way a gene is expressed. A gene can be turned on or turned off, and this is going to affect how the cell behaves. This diagram is showing a steroid hormone. Steroid hormones travel right through the cell membrane and to the nucleus itself, where it's going to actually directly affect the expression of the genes, of the DNA. So the steroid hormone itself travels into the cell and controls or changes the DNA. A non-steroid hormone, like this one here, would have a receptor molecule that attaches it, but then there will be a chain reaction of many different chemical reactions. The hormone does not actually travel inside the cell. It's these chemical reactions that make the change that happens in the nucleus, again, turning a gene on or turning a gene off. Okay, there's one last thing we need to talk about with the cell membrane, and that is the cell membrane is the reason why cells are so small. Remember that the cell membrane is what controls everything that comes in and leaves the cell. And the cell membrane is the outer surface of the cell. This table shows that as a cell, and these are models of cells like we built in the cell size lab, as the cell increases in size, the ratio of surface area to volume gets worse and worse and worse. In other words, for this small cell, there's 6 units of surface area for every 1 unit of volume. But as the cell gets bigger, there's less and less surface area. In other words, there's less and less cell membrane to bring materials into and out of the cell. What's going to happen is that the inner parts of the cell are not going to get the oxygen they need. They're not going to be able to get rid of their waste, and that limits how big the cell can get. Because the cell does not have complex transport systems for oxygen and waste and food and things like that, it's just relying on diffusion. The cell has to remain very, very small. So it's the cell membrane which is limiting the size of the cell. All right, that's it for this video. As always, if you have any questions, please ask me in class tomorrow.